The Vietnam War. It's a conflict that still echoes through American history, a scar on the national psyche. We've all seen the movies, heard the stories. But why did the world's greatest superpower fail to achieve its objectives in a small Southeast Asian nation? Was it a war that was lost on the battlefield? Or was it lost back home in the halls of Washington, D.C. and on the streets of America? Today, we're going to peel back the layers of propaganda and myth to expose the real reasons America failed in Vietnam. This isn't just another history lesson. This is a deep dive into the strategic blunders, the political miscalculations, and the cultural misunderstandings that doomed the American effort from the start. Let's begin with the fundamental flaw in American strategy, the very premise of the war itself. Washington saw Vietnam through the Cold War lens of the domino theory. The idea was simple. If South Vietnam fell to communism, then Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and the rest of Southeast Asia would follow like a row of falling dominoes. This fear drove the entire policy. But this was a massive oversimplification. The conflict in Vietnam wasn't just a proxy war between capitalism and communism. It was, at its heart, a civil war, a struggle for national independence that had been raging for decades, first against the French, and then against the Americans. Ho Chi Minh and the North Vietnamese weren't just Soviet puppets. They were nationalists fighting for a unified Vietnam. By failing to understand this, the U.S. fundamentally misjudged their enemy's motivation and resolve. They were fighting for their home, their identity. How do you defeat an idea with bombs and bullets? This misunderstanding led to a deeply flawed military strategy. The American approach, led by General William Westmoreland, was a war of attrition. The plan was to inflict such heavy casualties on the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army that they would eventually lose the will to fight. This was measured by the infamous body count. The problem was, for every enemy soldier killed, there were always more to take their place. The North Vietnamese government was willing to accept staggering losses to achieve their goal of reunification. They were playing a different game. The U.S. was fighting to win battles. The North Vietnamese were fighting to win the war, no matter how long it took or how high the cost. American soldiers would fight ferociously to take a hill, only to abandon it days later. This search and destroy tactic, without a clear objective of holding territory, was not only ineffective, but also incredibly demoralizing for the troops on the ground. Then came the Tet Offensive in January 1968. Militarily, Tet was a disaster for the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong. They suffered immense casualties and failed to hold any of their targets for long. But strategically, and more importantly, psychologically, it was a stunning victory for them. For years, the American public had been told that the war was being won, that there was light at the end of the tunnel. Suddenly, their television screens were filled with images of fighting in the streets of Saigon, even on the grounds of the U.S. Embassy. The message was clear. If the enemy could launch an attack of this scale, the war was far from over. The credibility of the U.S. government and military leadership was shattered. Walter Cronkite, the most trusted news anchor in America, went to Vietnam and declared the war a stalemate. When President Lyndon B. Johnson heard this, he reportedly said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." The Tet Offensive broke the American will to continue escalating the war. Beyond the battlefield, the war was being lost in the political arena, both internationally and domestically. The U.S. was supporting a series of corrupt and unstable governments in South Vietnam. These regimes lacked popular support and were seen by many Vietnamese as puppets of a foreign power. This made winning the hearts and minds of the local population a key tenet of counterinsurgency warfare, nearly impossible. How could you convince villagers to support a government that didn't represent them, against an enemy that spoke the language of nationalism and independence? Meanwhile, back in the United States, the anti-war movement was growing exponentially. The draft, which disproportionately sent working class and minority youth to fight, fueled widespread protest. The images of the war's brutality, napalm, Agent Orange, the My Lai massacre horrified the public and created a massive credibility gap between what the government was saying and what people were seeing. The war tore the country apart. It became politically unsustainable for any president to continue. So, did the US ever really stand a chance in Vietnam? It's a question historians still debate. With a different strategy, perhaps. If the US had understood the political and cultural nature of the conflict, if they had focused on supporting a legitimate and popular South Vietnamese government, instead of just propping up anti-communist dictators, if they hadn't tried to fight a conventional war against an unconventional guerrilla force, the outcome might have been different. But given the strategic blunders from the very start, the misreading of the enemy's resolve, and the ultimate collapse of political support at home, the American failure in Vietnam seems almost inevitable. It was a war based on a flawed premise, fought with the wrong strategy, for a cause that the American people, and indeed many Vietnamese people, ultimately did not believe in. The tragedy of Vietnam is not just in the lives lost, but in the lessons that had to be learned at such a terrible cost. Thank you for watching. If you found this analysis insightful, please like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into the pivotal moments of history. See you next time.